When I was a little kid, one of my earlier memories is of my mom and dad taking my brother and me down to this place in southeast Missouri. And from one of the hills, you can see about 4 or 5 states. And if you actually walk down to them, you can have one leg in Missouri. They say Missouri down there. Another leg in Tennessee, and an arm in Kentucky. You can literally be in 3 places at one time. Paul lived in 3 worlds, at least 3 worlds. Paul lived in the world of a Jewish man in his day, who, like the rest of the Jewish people in his day, struggled to figure out their identity in an all-encompassing, all-encroaching pagan world. A world where the cult of Caesar was burgeoning, and this emperor cult was threatening to take over the minds and the hearts of the people, of the Jewish people themselves. He stood there as a good Jew himself, with the values and the ideals of the Jewish people, but he also said things they had never heard before, things that to many of their ears were shocking. Paul also stood in the Greek world, in the world of Greece. It was the Greek world that taught him and taught many people how to think, how to value thinking and reason and the rational. It was from the Greek world that Paul developed this enormous desire to discover a faith that was rational and reasonable, that could stand the test of first principles and lead to conclusions that people even without faith might be able to understand. His love for thought came from the Greek world he stood in. And he stood in the world of Rome. He stood in the world of Rome, where the people and he himself lived under fearful submission. This Caesar's rule, this Caesar's domain, this cult of the emperor, making the emperor God, was taking over again the minds and the hearts of the people. They were subservient to the idea of Caesar, to Caesar himself. And he stood in this Roman world. And in the end, he was critical of that world. He did a lot to undermine that world. And in the end, ultimately, it was that Roman world that killed him, that executed him. But there was sort of like a 4th world, too. And that was the world in the midst of all these 3 where Paul stood, that was the world of the Messiah. He belonged to the family called the Messiah. As a good Jewish man, influenced by Greek thinking, under the fearful submission of Caesar and Rome, he stood in the family of the Messiah. He stood as belonging to the Messiah's body. And that's the world that in the end mattered the most to him. What worlds would people say we're a part of? Here in St. Louis, Missouri, at this time in the world's history, in this time in the nation's history, certainly we live in the world of America, the United States of America, on the verge of a huge election. Certainly we live in the world of the world community, where a lot of the economics are crazy right now and up and down, and natural disasters are threatening so many. And so many of the resources of this planet are being depleted, resources we've gotten accustomed to having at our disposal all the time. We live in that world too. And we live in the world of our work. For many of us, the university. The Caesars that mark a Washington University or whatever schools we're a part of are the Caesars that are part of where we each have a job. The CEOs, the COOs, all those that have the power, the directors, power over us. We are under their noses all the time. We live in at least those worlds, and then we live in that one other world called, for most of us at least, Catholic. What does it mean to carry a Catholic identity in the midst of all these worlds? That's where Paul lived. All these different worlds. So do we. Postmodern, many would say, late modernity at the very least. Neo-imperial, some would say. Non-colonial, perhaps. A world where the residue of the Enlightenment is still very much with us. The power of power itself and sex and money, which I would call part of the Enlightenment, as well as relativism, an extraordinary tolerance that's maybe not all that virtuous anymore, that might be even getting us in trouble. We stand in that world as Catholics. That's where we belong. We too belong to the Messiah's body. So many worlds that we're a part of. You might have already noticed that this is not really a homily today. This is a teaching. It's a teaching about a man named Paul they called an apostle. Today, he would have been 2,000 years old. He was born 2,000 years ago today. And the Universal Church has declared, starting today, this next year, the year of St. Paul. With all its incumbent graces and everything that comes along with that, the Universal Church is focusing on understanding this man named Paul and his influence to this day on these worlds, and especially where we find ourselves standing the most. This is not just a homily today, if I could say just. It's a teaching, rather. Stuff maybe we should be able to know and understand as this year unfolds before us. And so I'd like to make 4 points about Paul. 4 points that I think are significant enough for us to carry in our mind as we hear his words unfold in the year to come. You won't find me preaching very often, at least up until now, on that second reading, which is almost all Paul. Most of the time I stick with the gospel, rarely the first reading, hardly ever the second. But the church is asking us to focus more and more on that second reading because of the power it still has to shape a church and a world. 4 things about Paul. Number 1, where does Paul fit in with Jesus? Paul redefined monotheism. He was a good Jewish man who believed in one God, but he redefined one God. He believed in one God. He believed in one Christ, who was where God can be known and felt and touched and tasted in this world. And he believed in one people of God, and he believed in one future for God's world. One future for God's world. The parallels were this, if I could call them parallels. Jesus was the composer. Paul was the conductor. Jesus was the medical researcher. Paul was the doctor. Jesus was the architect. Paul was the builder. Paul kept pointing back to Jesus and Jesus' own unique achievement. But he didn't do it by saying and doing the same things Jesus did. He created a new way for this to happen in the worlds that he inhabited. Jesus' accomplishment had to be implemented. It had to be implemented, and Paul saw that as his job. Both Jesus and Paul passionately believed, this is the truth for both of their faiths, Jesus and Paul passionately believed that God was at last fulfilling his promise and launching a new age upon the world. And Paul's task was to name that, to name the Messiah and be a pioneer going to places which had never heard of Jesus, who never imagined anything as crazy as the story of a young crucified Jew who was now the Lord of the world, and Caesar was not. Our job, it seems to me, at least something you and I can think about, is what does it mean in the worlds we inhabit to let Jesus be the composer of the music and you and I become the conductor? We got to figure out how to translate the Jesus music, if you will, into the cultures you and I are a part of, even into our own families. We are the conductor, Jesus the composer. Jesus the medical researcher. Jesus has done all the research. Then the doctor has to apply it to this particular patient right now. You and I need to know the story of Jesus and the thought of Jesus enough to apply what he spoke, lived, died for to our own day. And the same with Jesus as architect. He drew up the plans for a new world. You and I have got to build that new world. But not like Paul did, not like Jesus did. The questions are different all the time. The challenges of the culture, Paul and Jesus never faced. Paul faced challenges Jesus never faced. Like the question of the Gentiles. A whole new world. You and I have got to figure out how to be the kind of pioneer Paul was in our day. That's going to take a little thought, you know. It's going to take a little work to figure out how you and I can do that uniquely our own way and get that crazy story of that young crucified Jew out in the world and in the face of the Caesars of this world. That's huge. The second thing about St. Paul is where he fits into the early church. I'm sure you're aware by now that there was a huge struggle in the early church between what you could call the liberals and the conservatives. The conservatives were, in their day, the people that kept wanting to keep it as it was, to conserve the tradition. The liberals were always trying to figure out where to stretch it, how to refresh it, how to make it meaningful in their day. Paul would have fallen most of the time in the camp of the liberals because while James led the charge that said, let's not change this, Jesus never meant us to change this, what are you thinking? When it came to who the good news was for, the Jewish people, Paul said, no, look what God is doing in the Gentile people. Look what God is up to in them. How can you deny that? And this was a huge clash. I can't even describe for you how huge it was. Most scripture scholars would actually say, though the Romans killed Paul, he was turned in, he was betrayed by his own, by fellow Christians. He was betrayed by his own who didn't like his thinking, who thought this idea of the Gentiles was dangerous to this movement called Christian. They turned him into Rome. Does the story sound familiar? Do you remember anybody else who was turned in and betrayed by his own? When we whine about the state of the church and whether or not the church is where we need it to be or where we think it should be, and we start to wonder about how we hurt each other still in this church of ours, between liberal and conservative, has anything changed? But Paul didn't bail. He didn't abandon ship. Under this enormous tension, he stayed. He stayed and he worked it out to the end, to the very end. The third point about Paul I think we need to remember for the future is Paul's vocation. What did he see was his to do? Paul's preoccupation was not only with human beings and their fate, which we call by the word justification. He wasn't just concerned about human beings and their fate. He was concerned about the way the God of Israel was creating a people from and for the world. That's why he preached and preached and preached, because he knew this could not be a kept secret. That there's something going on when the Word of God is proclaimed that starts to shape a people, create a people, sustain a people against all odds. The reason Gary Braun preaches and preaches and preaches, and so many others, including you in your own life, I hope, is because it does seem that there's something about this good news that's so strange in that it still moves human hearts and it still forms community. It generates a people and shapes them constantly, these followers. And it happens right under the nose of Caesar. It does that still, right under the nose of Caesar. The fourth question about Paul is his contribution. What has he contributed to us right now? And I dare say that the reason you and I are here 2,000 years after his birthday, that we come together in community with people who are not like us, people we don't even know, people beyond our kin or our own businesses, is because of Paul. Because that's what he did. He went around setting up communities, new communities were springing up, not characterized by warm fuzzies, really at all, but learning how to support each other in practical ways. From all kinds of backgrounds, they welcomed one another and supported one another to live a new way, in the midst of the world. We're here today as the Catholic Student Center because of that new way. Every parish in the world exists because that's what Paul saw to be the greatest strength against the Caesars of the world. And if we're going to make it under some of the fearful oppressions of our day, including what people tell us we should look like and act like and how much we should make and what our names really are, if we're going to make it through those oppressions of our cultures, of our world, it's going to be because we support each other. Against our own selfishness, we support each other to walk a different way. We can't do that by ourselves. Paul knew that. We're here because of him and the cells he set up, the network, the parishes, if you will, in all the key cities of the empire, so that they'd be there under the nose of Caesar. And Caesar would have to contend with them. Still, in our day, this is the truth. These cells were to live as a people so that other people could tell that this was God's family. There were to be certain traits in them that would emerge just because they were taking on this life. He didn't teach maxims, he taught people how to think, as the Greeks influenced him to do. He saw himself, and he wanted these cells, these parishes, this Catholic Student Center, to show a whole new kind of humanity to the world, a redeemed humanity, what it means to be truly human. And he kept working out what that meant in practical words, how to live. Unity, here, there, in every one of them, and still was the preeminent value. But I got to tell you, Paul also said certain things are not allowed. Certain boundaries need to be drawn. If we're going to have an identity in this other culture, we got to live a little bit differently than the other culture. And so in the name of tolerance, he didn't just accept anything. He came out, I remember, so strong at one point against incest, for example. Said, this is not okay. I know it's okay in this world, in this world, in this world, but it ain't okay. We're not doing this in these churches. That's not what it means to be followers of the Messiah. There were a lot of those conditions he put out there. There was no room for that great hallmark of the Enlightenment you and I call relativism in this church. These cells, let me say it one last time, were suspicious to their worlds. They were downright subversive. And it was the establishment of these united communities that could be seen and felt as a sign within Caesar's world that a new humanity had come into being, and challenged by its very existence as well as its explicit claims, the claims of the rule of Caesar. Paul kept the church on its toes. He refused to let us settle back and sleep with power. I don't know about you, but I wonder how far we've come from being a subversive presence at a university, in a country like the United States of America, at work. Those 4 points. Where Paul fits with Jesus, how he fits in the early church during its struggle, his personal vocation and his contribution to this day, which is us. What does that leave us with? It leaves us with simply this. And I can't think of a better thought as we celebrate 2,000 years ago, a man born into this world who changed the world. We got to be pioneers, you and I. It's not over. It ain't over. We have to be pioneers. We have to figure out how to do the next new thing that Paul and Jesus maybe never thought of. The whole issue of gays in this community and in the world has created an enormous challenge for the church to try to figure out how to love, how to include, how to walk the road together. What will that mean for us? That's just one example. Women are another example. We haven't figured it out yet. You and I got to figure it out. We got the first principles. We got to be the pioneers. We got to do the conversation. We got to do the dialogue. We got to do the work. And there's going to be some blood, sweat, and tears. And some of us are going to want to kill each other. Maybe not really. But verbally. And that's okay. We can stay in that struggle. It's worth it. It's just so worth it. But if we don't start seeing ourselves as pioneers, not just us together, and that's for sure, Paul would have said, the CSC has got to figure this out. But so do you. In your worlds, you got to figure this out. We got the music. Now we got to play it. We got the plans for the building. Now we got to build it. It's going to take, my friends, great courage to do this. Courage indeed. And in the end, as Paul would say, love. Great love. And so, happy birthday, Paul. 2,000 years young today.